Hello and welcome to a special edition of the President's Podcast. I'm John Fortney. Issue 1, or as we like to call it, the Political Outcomes Over People campaign, subtracts all of the anti-gerrymandering protections passed by the voters in 2015 and in 2018. The vote was 70% and more than 75% in 2018. It sacrifices competition and compact communities of interest in favor of guaranteed political power for the progressive left at the expense of you, the voter. We highlight the true danger of this foreign-backed, secretly funded campaign that slices and dices districts through an unaccountable panel selected by retired politicians. This week, we hear from State Senator Rob McColley, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, current Secretary of State Frank LaRose, Senator Theresa Gavarone, and former two-term Secretary of State Ken Blackwell. But we begin this week with Ohio Senate President Matt Huffman, who describes the danger and discriminatory nature of who even gets to serve on this panel.
And the main point really here is the question comes down to who is going to make the decisions. And in this case, we have a group of elected folks who are accessible to the public and have staffs who can go out and communicate with people and receive messages. This body is not going to be elected. You can't talk to them. They can spend as much money as they want. They're going to decide what is reasonable. You can't sue over whether what they say is reasonable or not. It says that, okay? And I think of all of these sort of outrageous things that are part of this, the most significant is the people who are excluded, who are not allowed to serve, and it says it in the Constitution. If you are elected, appointed, or were merely a candidate for any office or position at the federal, state, or local level, you're not allowed to be on this commission, nor are your families or your employees or anyone you had a contract with, okay? Now you think about that and you say, well, that could be a lot of people. Well, it could be. For example, United States military officers receive an appointment from the President of the United States, Secretary of Defense, various departments, and those folks, and this is in the 6 years prior to the time of the filing of the map, it's not at the moment, any time in the prior 6 years, they can't be on this. So those military officers are excluded, and their families are, and their employees are. So some employee of his decides, well, I'd like to do this. Through no action of their own, this military, I happen to work for this guy in a company after he retired from the military, I can't be on it. And this guy has a contract with somebody to come in and sell them materials or do whatever, he's out too. Police officers receive a commission, an appointment from the state of Ohio. They are excluded from serving this, and their families, okay? If you're a local appointed official, maybe the mayor appoints you to the Urban Forestry Council or whatever it is, or you happen to be a township trustee, or you're on a local school board, or maybe you ran for the local school board and lost, and because you were a candidate, you're out, and so's your family and your employees and anybody you had a contract with. And so when you start thinking about all of these people, some of whom they have nothing to do with why that guy's excluded except my relationship as a family member, an employee, or a contractor, and they're all excluded. Well, you start looking at these concentric circles, how many people is that? Well, it's probably in the millions. And the people who are excluded are the people who are most active in their community. And it may not necessarily be that they're map drawers or understand redistricting, but why should you be excluded? Because you decided nobody else is running for village council and they need people to step up and make decisions for my local village council, so I'm going to do that. And because of your willingness to help your community, you shouldn't be on the commission.
Neither should your family member.
And neither should your family.
Even if you lost.
Yeah, even if you lost. And, you know, I mean, you think about, for example, the appointments I make as a Senate president, and I call people up and I say, hey, I need to appoint, and people agree to be on these various commissions, some of them, the Rare Disease Study Council, and people are very interested in that because they have a child or a relative, and they meet and they make recommendations to the governor and the legislature and the Department of Health. Those people are all excluded, okay, because they receive that appointment at the state level, and their families are excluded, and employees and contractors. The boards of trustees at universities who are appointed by the governor, okay? And again, most of these appointments are at the local level. You can think of people who probably in many cities there might be the mayor appointed a commission to study the diversity efforts that the mayor wants to put forward. Those people are all excluded. So it's not just Republicans are trying to keep out. They're trying to keep out anybody who apparently is willing to step up and do good for their community. I mean, and when I read through this, and I've had other people say, yeah, that's what that really says, I'm like, well, why would they do this? And I think the answer is the people who drafted this, well, two reasons. One is I think they looked at what happened last year and thought, we can put in whatever we want, yell gerrymander, and pass it. And the other problem is what happens when these things are drafted by just a few people in a dark room, metaphorically, and they put it on the ballot. They don't have the process that the legislature has, where we have many people coming in, we have amendments, Republicans say this, Democrats say that, okay, we need to put this on the ballot with a certain number of votes, and let's get together and put something on that the public is going to support, which is what we did in 2015 and 2018. Instead, this is a bunch of folks in Washington saying, we're going to do what you want, and now you have this Frankenstein monster stomping all over the state of Ohio. I mean, I want to look at them as a part-time political consultant and say, you got to be kidding me. This is what you came up with? So I encourage people to read it and see, oh, under this, I can't be on this. And most people would take the time to read it, probably can't be on the redistricting commission.
And Blue Star and Gold Star families.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Right? That's offensive.
If you happen to be a widow or widower whose spouse was killed in the line of duty in the 6 years prior to the filing of this, you're ineligible to serve. And by the way, so are the members of the family of that slain police officer. And you know, those are, of course, heart-wrenching conclusions to make, but it's all of these other folks involved in their community that don't get to serve.
This really is a progressive, foreign-funded, deep state, dark money effort to enshrine gerrymandering in the Constitution. What's so troubling to this about this plan to you?
Well, first, let me just say that citizens, not politicians, would not meet a common sense truth in advertising test. It would have you to believe that state legislators elected by citizens are not citizens themselves, representing the voices and concerns of folks who elected them. And if you peel back the skin of the onion on issue one, what you find out is that they would replace elected representatives of the people with an unaccountable commission that would in fact do its work, do its damage, and then disappear, not to be held accountable again. So one, I decided that I wanted to first attack the fact that this was not truth in advertising, and that at a time when we are watching citizenship be devalued across this nation, Ohio cannot become party to that sort of nonsense, particularly when this initiative is being fueled by dark money and special interests that are anchored outside, not only outside of the state, but in this case, I think being fueled by the cash of a billionaire offshore.
And then this week, a group of former lawmakers, African-American lawmakers from Michigan and Ohio, also held a news conference in Columbus. And this, I just want to read you a couple of their comments. Sherry Gay Dagnogo, who served as a Michigan State Representative, was quoted as saying, because they had a similar issue that we are having on the ballot right now in Ohio. It was called Voters, Not Politicians in Michigan. But she said, quote, they cut Detroit up into 22 pieces. And then she went on to say, Well, I'll never turn my back on the black community and tell them that poison is good for you. This is poison. Issue 1 is poison because it will diminish and take away black leadership. And in fact, as we learned in Michigan, that the panel that drew the maps solely based on race, and a federal court told them that you violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Voting Rights Act and threw the maps out and told them to go back to the drawing board. And for the first time in 70 years, the city of Detroit, within the city limits, does not have an African American representing them in Congress. How disturbing is that to you as somebody who is African American, has a deep background in public service, and was a mayor of Cincinnati?
It's disturbing because, again, it really does marginalize, and as it was articulated in Detroit, it marginalizes the black voice to speak into the democratic process. And what's ironic about this whole deal is that I am sure that this unaccountable commission would in fact draw lines that actually would produce representatives that grew the muscularity of an administrative state.
A redistricting campaign that looks like this. This is the flowchart from one of their supporters about how simple this so-called citizens panel would be that would replace the current will of Ohio voters that set up the redistricting commission that passed a set of bipartisan maps with a unanimous vote last fall at the end of September. The governor came out strongly in opposition against the redistricting campaign, and I want to play a couple of his comments. You can also find this on our YouTube channel, but Senator, here's the first thing that he led his news conference off with this week.
If this ballot proposal were to be adopted, Ohio would actually end up with a system that mandates, that compels map drawers to produce gerrymandered districts. In fact, Ohio would have gerrymandering in the extreme. One of the reasons that voters will be unhappy with the maps that the amendment will produce is that the fall ballot proposal makes proportionality, it makes it king.
What do you think about the governor coming out and saying, first of all, bottom line on this entire issue, not only does it make proportionality king, and we'll talk more about that, but that it mandates and compels gerrymandered maps based on this voluminous 54-step plan, so-called Citizens Not Politicians panel that would, basically be running the show in Ohio. It compels gerrymandering. It doesn't get rid of gerrymandering. What's your thought about what the governor said?
So I think he hit the nail on the head. When most people will be asked to define gerrymandering, there will be a variety of definitions. But one central core of every definition will be that districts are drawn primarily to favor one party over another. Another common theme will be that communities, counties, cities, and other areas that share common interests will be split up solely to favor one party over another. And what this amendment will do is that it will mandate that we split up communities and cities and counties in order to achieve a political threshold for one party over the other. And so when people look at maps, when citizens look at maps, it's easy for them to look at the common geographic boundaries of the state of Ohio and say, okay, that's a city, it was kept together, that's a county, it was kept together. Sometimes we have to go outside of that under our current process just to achieve population thresholds, which I think you're probably going to touch on too. Just to achieve population thresholds, you might get a rough edge in some cases. But on the other hand, people can tell when cities and communities were needlessly split up solely to achieve a political outcome.
And the maps that we have today are some of the most compact communities of interest in the history of Ohio. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, but this initiative is going to mandate that those communities get split up.
I think that you talked about if you hated the snake on the lake, it is coming back. Here's what the governor went on to say about splitting communities in this citizens campaign.
Proportionality must be adhered to and is more important than and must supersede the following. 1, proportionality must supersede the importance of respecting county, village, city, and township lines. Number 2, proportionality must supersede the importance of keeping communities of interest together. 3, proportionality must supersede, and let me quote from the ballot amendment directly, and I quote, again, proportionality must supersede the equal functional ability of politically cohesive and geographically proximate racial, ethnic, and language minorities to participate in the political process and to elect candidates of choice.
That certainly sounds like a violation of what much like happened in Michigan, where a federal court said you violated the Voting Rights Act. When proportionality means more than what the Voting Rights Act says about race, what the Voting Rights Act says about everything else, and that we're going to split communities out until we finally receive the proportional or a percentage-based fixed outcome, otherwise known as gerrymandering. They call it representational fairness, but really this is a proportionality within issue 1, and this whole campaign is nothing other than a far-left gerrymander.
So that's exactly what it says, and I think anybody who's concerned about the Voter Rights Act and creating majority-minority districts where it's possible to be created should be very concerned about that. This ballot proposal has striking similarities to Michigan, and Michigan, for the first time in, I believe it's 70 or 80 years, does not have an African-American congressman or woman representing them in the United States Congress because of their redistricting amendment. Michigan also had their first map thrown out as a violation of the Voter Rights Act because it was a racial gerrymander. And this would lead to racial gerrymandering, and that's the point that the governor is making, is that because it's trying to maximize the amount of districts that would be created for Democrats, it's going to go into those extremely high Democrat precincts that oftentimes are in minority neighborhoods, and it's going to crack them apart into separate districts because they need those 90% precincts, those 85% Democrat precincts. They need them to stretch out into the suburbs if they're going to create the amount of Democrat districts that they're hoping to create.
You know, we like to talk about how candidates' campaigns and issues matter. Candidates' campaigns and the issues really won't matter under the Citizens Issue 1 campaign, will it? I mean, doesn't this take the competition out of elections for the most part when you are drawing districts based on percentages and proportionality?
It seeks to create predetermined political outcomes.
Here's the most cynical part of this. What lies at the heart of this entire effort, and again, incredibly cynical, is this idea that there should be a certain number of Republicans in the General Assembly and a certain number of Democrats in the General Assembly, and that they're going to gerrymander the districts to accomplish that preconceived certain number of districts for Republicans and Democrats. What an undemocratic idea. Right. Because it's up to the people. That is gerrymandering. It's the textbook definition of it.
Right, and unlimited splits in communities of cities, townships, county splits.
And unequal districts population-wise as well. There's no requirement within this system, within this proposal, that says districts need to be equal population. So you could have a large district and a much smaller district, and really that undermines the whole idea of one person, one vote. And they like to call it proportionality or representational fairness, which basically equals fixed outcomes and is the purest definition of gerrymandering.
Absolutely, which is why we changed the language.
Which was also interesting because it really received some pushback, because the language from the Secretary of State's office talked about how they wanted to draw or manipulate the map. You made a motion and it was accepted and passed on a 3-2 vote to change the word manipulate to gerrymandering.
Which is exactly what this is. And if you look it up in the dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary, this is the very definition of gerrymandering. So let's tell the people what this really is.
And I supported that motion because it states very clearly what this is. Manipulating districts to achieve a political outcome is the Oxford Dictionary definition of gerrymandering. So let's replace that with the word that's in common usage. But then some of the members of the ballot board were complaining that that's an unfair word, or that's a word that has a negative connotation. But then we started looking through the actual amendment language that their side proposed, and that includes the word gerrymander. So they're actually using the word gerrymander in their proposed amendment, but for us to use it in the ballot language is somehow off limits. I think that's a pretty wild idea.
Also, a part of what was being discussed was what was being omitted, or what had been omitted from the Citizens Not Politicians ballot summary that they suggested. There is a Ohio Supreme Court case that the current face of the Citizens Not Politicians campaign, former Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor, she concurred with on a 6-1 vote. It's called Voters First, and it made very clear that voters have a right to know exactly what they're voting on, and it uses a term called materially omitting something. In other words, I would call it improperly ignoring, maybe illegally ignoring. And there seemed to be a lot of subject matter that was improperly or materially ignored, starting with, as you mentioned, how we come up with the 15 people on the commission from a group of 90 people. And part of what you changed in your initial summary coming from the Secretary of State's office was how the board was developed, all the way down to exactly what criteria will be used, like we have right now, that limits how many times that you can split a municipality, that provides compact districts. There's strict rules right now with the redistricting process that we all live under right now that says you cannot split towns and communities and political subdivisions more than one time or no times. So it's resulted in compact communities of interest. So there seemed to be a lot that was materially omitted, or as I like to say, improperly ignored.
Well, and it's disappointing, but not surprising, that at the time Justice O'Connor would author a decision on the Ohio Supreme Court that establishes rules for certain people, but not for her, and that once she is, backing a cause, those just get ignored.
One of the things about materially omitting part of this very lengthy ballot proposal, the approved ballot language said nothing about who will be selecting the commission members. I mean, how do you get to selecting the group of retired judges that are supposed to then institute the guardrails around how we select 90 people? I mean, the chicken or the egg first? It's very unclear, and maybe ambiguously so. It was written that way, so it provided some leeway for them to kind of make it up as they went along.
Let's contrast that with who chooses the current redistricting commission members. Very clear.
Accountability.
The people of Ohio
voters
choose the current. And so some would say, but their districts are skewed. Well, not the, perhaps, I don't agree with that, but the boundary lines of Ohio have been in place for well over 200 years. And so there's 3 of us on that commission that are elected statewide. And by the way, all 3 of us are Republicans because that's who the voters have chosen. So the current process relies on the voters choosing who's going to serve on the redistricting commission. This new process is this, again, a Rube Goldberg, very convoluted, perhaps intentionally convoluted process for how do you come up with these 15 individuals that are going to be, ordained by these retired judges to do this work and not have any political opinions about it whatsoever. It's a foolish notion. Sorry.
And the elected officials are accountable to the voters.
Yeah.
If the voters don't like the way these lines are drawn, they can vote you out.
Sure. By the way, which they didn't take the opportunity to do when they had the chance to do that, right? So
Absolutely. But under this plan, the voters have no say.
There will be pinwheel districts that go from downtown Cincinnati out into Butler, Warren, and Claremont County. And the folks who are going to win those in a Democratic primary are not going to be the people who live in downtown Cincinnati. But it's okay from the viewpoint of the people who are sponsoring this because they're going to be the kinds of Democrats they want. And this isn't an unusual process. This has happened in California. It's happened in Arizona. It's happened. The map that they drew a map, which they used in 22. The new Supreme Court in Wisconsin threw it out, hired their own map maker, because their Constitution doesn't forbid the Supreme Court from drawing a map, where ours does. And they paired, roughly about 4/5 of Republicans in the same district. So it was clearly a partisan process. It's what you're going to see here if this passes.
You talk about the court drawing the map. Certainly under this plan, the court can draw the map. Jen Miller from the League of Liberal Misinformation in a Columbus Dispatch podcast a few months ago, the League of Women Voters, but I called them the League of Liberal Misinformation, said, but at the end of the day, there was no explicit ability for the Supreme Court to draw their own maps or get their own mapping masters. We have that now with this plan.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason, because the constitutional reform that we passed specifically said the Supreme Court shall not draw a district or any map. I mean, they're constitutionally forbidden. That's why they didn't have a map maker, and they knew it. Now, in sort of trying to back into it, they said, well, you guys draw the map the way we say. And we've tried to do that 2 or 3 times, and as we did, they said, well, not good enough.
They added new criteria.
Added new criteria.
Here in the Constitution.
Yeah, and at some point, it was well, we're only going to, we don't even know what ultimately they will agree to, and that's why when you can't have a vote for your representatives and senators, the federal court steps in and imposes a map on you.
Well, I've had a few people ask me when I'm at the gym or just out, or my neighbors say, what's this whole gerrymandering amendment about? And I always boil it down to fixed outcomes, because it's proportionality, which is just another word for gerrymandering. No accountability, zero accountability, because of the panel that disappears forever and you, the voter, have nowhere to turn to. And it's an attack on democracy because it repeals the anti-gerrymandering amendments and good faith negotiations and limited splits of political subdivisions in cities and towns and neighborhoods that you, the voter, passed in 2015 and 2018. What would your minute-and-a-half long answer be, or what you've been telling people about the political outcomes over people campaign, what it really is and why it's a bad deal?
Well, number one, it requires political gerrymandering, no question about that. Number two, the folks who are going to be making the decisions exclude most of the people who have been involved in their community or their government, and it's going to be all the people, if you can find people who want to do that, those are the people who are going to be on this. And of course, they don't have any experience, they don't or knowledge about this, so they're going to rely on outside experts really to tell them what to do. You're not allowed to have any input except in a very specific way, so you're not allowed to talk to these folks. They can't be removed except by themselves. Their judgment can't be questioned in court. Only the proportionality is what you can sue on. So you can't even sue for the redress of your grievances, if you recognize that term. It's in the United States Constitution. They have an unlimited budget, which can't be questioned. It really sounds like something like, well, if that was our government, we all really wouldn't like that, because none of that is true about the Ohio General Assembly or the governor or even the Supreme Court, which are elected. And all the things we do at local level to make sure that there's public input. We have hearings on zoning, on all sorts of changes that may happen. You can go to your city council and be heard, or your county commissioners, all those things. None of that is true with arguably one of the most important decisions, maybe the most important decision every 10 years that the people of the state of Ohio have to make. And so I guess I'm not sure if that's longer than a minute and a half, but I would really encourage people to try to read this as long as it is, or at least look into it and say, and challenge people who say they're for it and say, well, here's what Matt Huffman said. Is that true? Now, they may say, well, I don't like Matt Huffman, but yeah, that's true. So I think that, like everything, the best voter is an educated voter.
Ohio Senate President Matt Huffman, thanks for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much, John.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.